So we're going to get started in 1 second. I'll just, a little bibliography. We're going to focus tonight primarily on God in Search of Man, one of the most famous writings of Abraham Joshua Heschel. We're just going to refer to him tonight as Heschel, because that's how often people refer to him. And although he was a doctor and a rabbi, and man's quest for God, so the parallel to this book. There's also The Insecurity of Freedom, a number of essays. Man is Not Alone, also The Sabbath, highly recommended. Apparently there was another work written in the 60s called it was written in Hebrew, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, Baspaklaria Shel Adorot, something like that. It's about the oral tradition, and apparently that's really something, more deep scholarship, more textual scholarship, and worth reading. In any event, just a quick Wikipedia kind of a review of Rabbi Heschel. He was born in 1907, and he was part of a large family. He was descended from all kinds of greats. His name is the same as the Apter Rebbe, because he's related to him. He's also related to the Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, so he has great Hasidic roots. And it seems that by 20 he had already studied a lot of Torah, and he went off to Berlin, where he got a PhD. And then he ran into trouble with the Germans, but he found he was able to teach in Germany with Leo Beck, with Buber and his crowd in Germany. And later he was in Warsaw a little bit. He got deported to Warsaw. He was able to teach there as well. He was brought to America through the Hebrew Union College. Many of the different seminaries had programs to help bring great scholars. He was able to come. That's a Reform seminary. But eventually he found his home at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where there was somewhat an uneasy marriage, because it was a very academic place, a lot of textual scholarship. Here was someone who wrote in flowing sentences, and one sentence didn't necessarily flow into the other. It was just a lot of pithy sayings together. And although he was a great scholar, but he was viewed as not the true scholar like some of the other people who were more textually oriented. There was a lot of work on different determining which was the proper text of the Talmud or the Midrash, or different things like that. And he wasn't part of that school, so he sort of was a little bit alone there. But his legacy is far beyond most of the other colleagues there who criticized him for many years. It's a little unusual that here in an Orthodox synagogue we're discussing a man who spent most of his life in the Jewish Theological Seminary, but it's not unusual because I think Rabbi Heschel was read very broadly, even in the Christian community. Is widely read, and two of his greatest achievements, politically speaking, were that his writings were read very widely in Christian circles, and that he had an influence and was involved in the Vatican II Council and in sort of changing the face of Catholicism forever, hopefully. And of course, as you know, my teacher, Rabbi Soloveitchik, was opposed to this type of thing. He felt that if the Christians want to change their views, let them do that. We don't want to have any counter-reformation where we have to be asked to change our religion to meet other religions. But nonetheless, Heschel very much was an ecumenicist in the sense that he truly believed in some sort of pluralistic view in which no religion has the total truth. And this is not something I can agree with either. But I'm not here tonight to discuss things I don't agree with. I'm here to share with you the God's quest for man, God in Search of Man. And what I've done is I've put together a lot of the different pithy statements that are made. If you run out of chairs out there, just let me know. I'll open the door for you. There's some more chairs next door. What I've done is, since Heschel is very much prone to have these amazing one-liners followed by various other sentences, and in some ways you feel like you're reading a lot of great one-liners sort of strung together, what I've done is I've culled out what I thought were sort of highlighted passages from different parts of the book, mostly the first 2/3 and some of the end of the book. And I'm hoping that will be the basis for a fruitful and inspiring discussion of some of his writings. And I also noticed that he references himself, meaning a number of times in the footnotes. It's not a deeply footnoted type of work, because again, mostly his own thoughts. But Some chapters have significant number of footnotes and significant length of the footnotes. It's very interesting. His sources are very broad, within Jewish sources, classical sources, Jewish philosophy, Jewish Talmud, Midrash, and all around. So in any event, I thought that I would give an overview. I forgot to mention, and I was starting to say that there were two great accomplishments. Of course, the other one here in the South we need not discuss, and that is, of course, that he marched with Martin Luther King. It's interesting, in the recent movie Selma, my wife was telling me that she heard that they said, wait a second, where's Rabbi Heschel marching with King in Selma? And they said, well, that didn't fit into their narrative. And so it's interesting, we've sort of been finally written out completely from the story of what happened there. But in any event, it's not forgotten. And everyone knows that Heschel marched with Martin Luther King. And as it says here, his feet were praying. And Lenny, I think, mentioned the other week, when he marched in Selma, my feet were praying. I don't know if that's a statement that it's better than regular prayer, but in any event, an interesting statement. Okay, so let's take, there's Dr. Levy, welcome. And Dr. Levy, I know it sounds like you're really into Dr. Heschel, so anything you want to add, please feel free to, or comment at the end. We'd be glad to hear some of your comments.
Thank you.
So again, some excerpts. Let's get started. I apologize in advance. There are a number of typos here. My apologies. I tried to make sure that these sentences were actually lifted from the book. Here and there, typos, or here and there, I wanted to condense a couple of sentences into another. So let's take a look. A lot of his work is saying what philosophy isn't. And again, this relates to his history as a criticized academic, that he's saying philosophy is not what you think it is in your philosophy department. Philosophy is what I do, which is sort of the gut of being a philosopher, not talking about philosophy or analyzing philosophy. So here you see elements of that in our first sentence. So he says, the task of philosophy, of religion, is to discover the questions to which religion is an answer. We're now on page 2, the top, where it says God in search of man. Excerpts. Once again, the task of philosophy of religion is to discover the questions to which religion is an answer. So that's statement number 1 we can talk about. He says, we sometimes forget the questions to which religion is an answer, to which Judaism is an answer. And he tries, at the same time, the subtitle of his book is A Philosophy of Judaism, but at the same time, he's also describing religion and religious experience in general. Now, so we have to rediscover what are the questions to which Judaism is the answer. And he thinks if we get to that, we'll get to it better than to ask questions that we want to ask as philosophers. We want to know, how do we know there's God? That's not the question to which Judaism is the answer. Right? In other words, how do we know he's God? Judaism is not trying to answer the question, is there a God? Judaism is trying to do something else. We'll talk about what it is. But so things they discuss in philosophy class, not his class, are things which are not the answer to which the question to which Judaism is the answer. Okay. A question which we do have to ask is the existence of God a probability to us? Right? There's an idea that, well, among some philosophers, you can't prove it 100%, but it's a probability. Is it a mere possibility, hypothesis, or is he a living presence? That's a rhetorical question. To Heschel, clearly God is a living presence. That's where the philosophy begins and ends. It's a living presence. The question is, how can he write about it? It's an ineffable experience. So how are we going to talk? How are we going to pretend to be sophisticated philosophers to talk about something that you can't talk about? Because it's beyond what you can talk about. It's just the idea that God is a living presence. That's the philosophy of Judaism. That's the question is, where is his presence? And the answer is Judaism, which finds God as a living presence. Something like that. Moving along, the ultimate intention of religious thinking is to answer a question which is not man's and to satisfy God's need for man. I may have mangled the quotation a little bit. In other words, once again, religion is not interested in answering man's question, right? How do we know there was a Torah? How do we know there was a God? Those are man's questions. Religion is interested in satisfying God's need for man. And that gets back to the title of the book, which we'll get to later. I'll have to talk more about that later. But it's about the relationship between God and man, not to answer man's questions. Okay. In general, he says the dichotomy of the holy and the good, as opposed to other things, the holy and the good is the holy versus good, or God versus good, is alien to the spirit of the great prophets. So they're thinking the righteousness of God is inseparable from his being. What is he referring? What's one of the major philosophical questions about God and good? What's the big question?
Evil.
Oh, that's another one. Yeah, there is a whole chapter here on evil. I didn't get into it. But one of the big questions, I suppose, of Philosophy 101 is whatever God says is good because that's what God said, or is there something called good, and God ascribes to that outside criterion called goodness, and or no, there's no outside criterion outside of whatever God says. Whatever God says is good, that's what's good. That's how we know it's good, because God said it. So that's a very nice discussion in a philosophy class if he was interested in teaching classic philosophy. But he says that whole dichotomy between the holy, meaning godly, and the good, it's alien to the spirit of the great prophets. The prophets are not interested in the relationship. Is God, does goodness come from God, or does God make up goodness, or is there goodness beyond God? This Shabbat we were talking about Rabbi Lichtenstein, his article about, is there an ethic beyond the halacha? He says this is not a Jewish topic. The great prophets were not thinking this way. We have to think the way they were thinking. The righteousness of God is inseparable from his being. It's not that God is good, in that he decided to be good or something like that, or he conforms to some outside measure of good, but rather that God is good as part of his being. It's inseparable from it. So he just knocks that question off as sort of nonsense. For example, Rabbi Lichtenstein, of blessed memory, also viewed that as sort of obvious. In the Bible, he says, it's clear, Tov Hashem Lakol, God is goodness, there's no question about it. Moving along. To try to distill the Bible, which is bursting with life drama and tension, right? So he says, the Bible it's alive, it's all kinds of stuff going on. There's good, and there are good people and bad people, and even the good people are a little bit bad, the bad people are a little good, and it's so complicated who's good and who's bad, and it's so full of life drama, and it's so interesting. Sorry, I have Rabbi Lichtenstein on my mind because he just passed away recently, but he said that, the Jewish texts are so exciting because you never know what they're saying, and they're so enigmatic, and it's always so exciting. So he says, to distill the Bible, which is bursting with life drama, to a series of principles, to just say, well, it's the 13 principles of faith. What's important is not the story of creation, or the story of Shavuot, or the Sinai, or anything like that. What's important are the principles thereof, right? The principles of faith. He said that would be like trying to reduce a living person to a diagram, right? What is Joel Finkelstein? He's a rabbi, and he's also went to this school, and he did that, and that's the sum of who I am, Father, and that's the principles of what I am, Orthodox rabbi, right? 2 words sums up the whole thing. So too, to say that the Torah, which is so much of stories, he said, well, what is the Torah? He said, look at the Torah. Oh, it must be principles and stuff like that, philosophy. Well, not really. It's not really a philosophy work. Well, what is it mostly? Well, mostly it's kind of stories. Stories? Well, then how do you reduce it? You can't. On the other hand, he who will try to reduce the Bible to a catalog of events, to a sacred history, will equally fail. He rejects that also. That, it's just a lot of events. We just finished Shavuos, the holiday of Shavuos. If you believe, that was commemorated the Mount Sinai. So if you believe in Mount Sinai, then you believe in Passover, about the Exodus, and then you believe in creation, and you believe in this. So then you believe in all the things that happen. Then that's the be all the end all of the Torah. It's about believing these stories or a catalog of events. So he thinks Really? Is that what the Torah is? It's a catalog of events? So he said, well, people who are philosophically oriented, right, who turn to the Greeks and the Plato and Aristotle, and they say, oh, this is real philosophy. And then, what is this Jewish stuff? Let's see if we can put it through the prism of Greek philosophy, and where does it fit into that box of Greek, of real philosophy? So he says, well, if you're that type of person, then you end out with two approaches. The first approach is to claim the Bible is a naive book, poetry, mythology, right? That's if you say there's an objective thing called great philosophy, and then you look at the Bible, you say, it's not a great book, it's a bunch of myths and poems and stuff, and it's not one of the great works. What we need to do is study, real philosophy. Second approach, claim that Moses taught the same ideas as Plato or Aristotle. Really, if you reread Moses, what he really means is the same as Plato or Aristotle. Maybe an oblique critique of the Rambam, who one might argue deserves a little critique in that he was very Aristotle oriented. That there's no serious disagreement between the teaching of the philosophers and the teaching of the prophets. So he rejects both of these ideas. We can't reduce the Torah to Aristotle, and we can't reduce it to a bunch of principles, and we also certainly don't want to reduce it to mythology or poetry. So what is the essential thought? And here I'll invoke another rabbi of mine from the Gush, from my yeshiva. Rav Meidan said, what is the Bible? Where does it begin? Where does it end? Maybe where it begins and where it ends sometimes tells you about a book, right? You figure, I'll skip to read the beginning, get the general idea. At the end, okay, I got it. So how does it start? How does it start? God created the world, and he breathed into our nostrils, and he told Adam and Eve to do certain things. And how does it end? Temple's destroyed, and woe unto me. Things are in pretty bad shape. Maybe there'll be another temple. Period. Or if you look at the real narrative ends in the Book of Kings, the exile, end of story. So then there's some addendum stories that are addended, such as Ezra and Nehemiah coming back the second time. But the Malachim, the Book of Kings, kind of ends the basic narrative that starts with Genesis. We were exiled. So what story does that tell? And it's going to relate to Heschel in 1 second. What story does it tell? The story of the relationship of man to God in a deep way. Obviously, we could have a relationship with God, and the Neanderthal man could have a relationship with God, and we can have a relationship with God, but in that deep kind of way, starting with Adam in the Garden of Eden, and by his very creation, and ending with the end of prophecy and the end of the Jews in Israel, where there was prophecy. That's all there is to talk about. That kind of deep relationship, that's something to talk about. That's something to write home about. Short of that, it's not worth writing home about. I believe that there's a similar idea here, that the essential thought of Judaism is to a living God, something like that. That it attests to a living God, the God who is in part of Exodus and splitting the sea and conquest of Israel and the great judges and the great kings and the great prophets. It's a testament to a living God. While the Bible claims to convey the words of inspiration, it also contains words of human search and concern. So this is an interesting statement. Some traditionalists may find objection to it. It's a reasonable statement, I think, which is, my opinion, that if you ask what is the Bible, some Christians like to say it's the Word of God. Well, you say that David's Psalms are the Word of God. Yeah, clearly they're inspired by God in a special kind of way that I can never be inspired. It's David on a different level than you and me and the local poet. But it's the words of David. I mean, that's the whole idea. His prayers of David. And there's the wisdom of Solomon, which constitutes a number of different books like Ecclesiastes and Proverbs. So it's interesting to note that the human search for God is also part of the Torah. So that kind of fits into his theme of God's search for man, man's search for God. But craving for God has never subsided in the Jewish soul. So the craving continues. A little one-liner there. For instance, Yehuda Halevi, the great medieval poet from Spain, said, to see the face of my God. He is my sole desire. That's my desire. My heart has said, God says, my heart has said, seek you. Now you Jew, human being, see, what should you seek? My face. That he wants us to seek him. God is waiting for me to seek him. And in many ways, that's God in search of man when God's waiting for us. God's waiting for us to, we have it on our Yom Kippur davening and our prayers on Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, we say that that Yom Oto T'chakelo, that God is waiting for man to return and repent. Or his whole life, our whole lives, God is saying, well, he messed up again and again and again, but he's going to get there eventually. Okay. God is waiting for me to seek him. Okay. Then he talks about 3 trails that lead to God. And I think, anytime you make up some sort, a trilogy of some sort, there are 3 ways you can do. I think, there are other ways, but can't argue with Drush. In many ways, many of his talks are sort of homilies. So, in any event, he says, and I need to work through this a little bit better. The first way is the sensing of the presence of God in the world. So we're going to talk a lot about that. The second is the way is sensing his presence in the Bible. I don't have as much excited here about that. And the third is the way of sensing his presence in sacred deeds. Sacred deeds both of God and I suppose of man as well. I don't have the full elaboration of that here. So let's talk a little bit about finding God in the world. He does mention that these 3 principles correspond, vaguely speaking, to the 3 principles on which the world stands, which are Torah, Avoda, worship of God, and Gvul Chasadim are the sacred deeds, the acts of kindness, and Torah, presence in the Bible, and then sensing God in the world, that would be some sort of prayer through our relationship with nature. Now, when we talk about our relationship, finding God in the world, he says in general there are 3 ways that we may relate ourselves to the world. We could exploit it. We could, we may enjoy it, and we may experience it in awe. So Rabbi Soloveitchik also talks about this. He's a little more positive. Rabbi Soloveitchik is actually in some ways more accepting of the idea of the significance of pursuing stuff. I hate to say this, but if you contrast Lonely Man of Faith, which we'll take a little look at next week, and Heschel's work, Heschel is very much into the idea that we sort of waste our time collecting stuff, or that we're way too egocentric. Rabbi Soloveitchik sees a dichotomy in the world that on the one hand, man looks at the earth and says, how can I exploit it? What can I do with this world? And isn't this exciting? And Rabbi Soloveitchik says, that's great. That's a mandate of the human being to exploit nature, to take nature and try to do something with it and be partners with God in creation. And but we can't stop there. Rabbi Soloveitchik says to modern man, says to successful man, he says, and I'm sorry, we're going to use the word man a lot tonight. It's written in 1956, so but obviously we're referring to human beings. So Rabbi Soloveitchik says it's one of the mandates of man. He just kind of encourages him and says, well, but that you can't be unipolar. You have to get to the other pole, which is that we're here to just sit in awe of the universe and say, I can't figure anything out. I'm just in awe. So that's Rabbi Soloveitchik. There's that tension. For Heschel, he says, you people, you think, you're all separated from God because you're so busy, so excited about, all the stuff you're going to create. He didn't even know in 1956, about iPads and space travel, and he didn't even know where we were going, but everyone knew where we were heading, more or less, and he was utterly unimpressed with it. So he says, generally, we look at the world and we say, how can we exploit it? But he says we can also experience it in awe. So he goes through a whole kind of thing about awe, and friend of mine once said to me, I think he got it from Heschel, was that we don't have children of awe. Children who say, that's interesting, it's so red, but on the corner it's sort of, it's a light red, and these chairs here, how is this attached, to the, do our kids have time for this kind of stuff anymore? No. They don't, right? That's children of awe, So, I don't mean that they should be spacey or anything, but there's people who are in awe. I once was trying to teach in a Sunday school, teaching the kids about, well, there's honoring your parents, so you're supposed to honor them and you're supposed to be in awe of them. They were like, what? It was like such a disconnect. I was like, there's the Rashi and the Talmud. I was all ready with my sources, and they had no idea what I was talking about. So I happened to have had very good access to Rabbi Soloveitchik at that particular time. So I was in his apartment, and I said, well, how do you teach the children about honoring your parents? He says, no, you can't. You can't. And Heschel picked up on the same thing, that our kids have no idea what that would be. And this is in the 50s, when supposedly father knows best or something. But he realized that there was no awe. And remember, he saw it coming, there's no awe. So he says, the Greeks acquired wisdom in order to comprehend. In other words, wisdom is something you do in order to do something else. This is something also Rabbi Lichtenstein railed against, because he was into the humanities. His earlier jobs in life related to things that you couldn't do anything with, like being a literature professor or a literature geek of some sort. And but in the Greek world, which is more and more, we live in a world really totally dominated, really fully adopting the Greek view, which is that what do you mean? Ideas are not important. What's important is how you make a living, right? And I think also a great disconnect about Jewish education. It's like, Jewish education, but how's my child going to achieve great things in the world? In other words, the only point of education is to achieve. And right, a Jewish school says, no, there's other stuff, and you want to learn about values, and you want to learn about a relationship with God. So because if the world is only power to it, so the Hebrews learned in order to revere. The more they would learn, the more they would revere. There's a Greek idea, which is the beginning of knowledge is knowing you don't know anything. So when you learn, you're in awe of all that there is to know. That's a Jewish idea. The Greek, he quotes Coleridge, who says that the Hebrews own awe. We own that more than the Greeks. If the world is only power to us, if that's what whole world is about, power, right? Success, stuff like that, and we're all absorbed in the gold rush. That's after all what we often get involved in. Then the only God we may come upon is the golden calf. As we're looking, where's God? Where's God? So he said, yeah, but what are you all about? I'm about the gold rush. No, again, I'm humbled to talk about this. Obviously, we need to make a living, and I'll appreciate people who do make a living, and support people like me who don't make a living. But the seminary is falling apart right now in front of our eyes because not enough people who do make money to support it. So, but I think we can all appreciate this preaching that he's doing, that really what we really want for the kids is success. And in a world in which the only value is success, you look around and say, well, where's God? You say, well, you're deaf to it because all you're thinking about is the money. We teach the children how to measure, how to weigh, how much does it weigh, the how and what of how much does it weigh, go to the laboratory, how do you measure it? But we fail to teach them how to revere, how to sense the wonder and the awe. Right? Soloveitchik also complained. He said, I could teach my students the Rambam and the Maimonides and the Talmud and everything, but to understand, what it means. Oh, Shabbos is coming. Oh, I got to get ready. Shabbos is coming. He said, he says that my students make Shabbos, but they don't understand how to get excited about it. Like my grandmother or something. You've got to make more soup. The Shabbos is coming. We've got to do something about this. So the awe is not there. The theme of biblical poetry. So you might say, well, what about biblical poetry? They were very struck with the world as like impressed with the what is our relationship to the world? Just awe. I thought biblical poetry loved the beauty of nature. For instance, my father, he loved the Psalm of Rosh Chodesh. I think it's 106 or 109, I always forget. You can check in your siddur. Baruch Nafshi. And there it talks about the rocks and the animals, and they wake up in the morning and they find their food and everything's harmonious in nature and everything's great. And God is out there providing for all the little creatures and all that. It's a beautiful description of nature. So I thought, this is a beautiful psalm. It speaks about the beauty of nature. So that's an imprecise way of looking at it. And Heschel helped me realize that. Doctor, I can't see you over there. Can you want to come into the circle? Yeah? Okay. No. Yeah, there's room over here too. Okay. Okay, good. So he says, no, you will not find in biblical poetry. Larissa, I want to see you too. But okay. Good. In biblical poetry, what you're looking at is not psalms that appreciate the beauty of nature. You missed the point. It's an imprecise way of describing psalms that seem to be discussing the beauty of nature. No, it's the awe of nature. The theme of biblical poetry is not the charm or the beauty of nature, it's the grandeur. It's a sublime aspect. Sublime meaning holy, beyond. How would you describe? How would you translate sublime? Otherworldly, perhaps. It's holy. It's something close to holy. In any event, a sublime aspect of which biblical poetry is trying to celebrate. The sublime is the silent allusion of things to a meaning greater than themselves. There you go. There's a definition. That's what we're all thinking, right? The silent allusion of things to a meaning greater than themselves. Notice what he says. What are we looking for? We're looking for a meaning greater than ourselves. That's the problem. That's what we're really seeking in life. We're looking for a meaning greater than ourselves. So when we look at nature, we say, wow, I think I sense in this, not the fact that the tree is so tall or the nature is so orderly or something, but in the grandeur of it, right? In the of it, right? You sense something greater than yourself, and then you say, now I've found God in something greater than myself. It is not the sublime as such. So first he says, it's the sublime, and Jews are into the sublime, and Jews are really into the sublime, and he says, well, no, but we're not really. It's not the sublime as such, which the biblical man is aware. To him, the sublime is but a way in which things react to the presence of God. The sublime is sort of an echo of God. To him, the sublime is but a way in which things react. The reaction to the sublime, and then how are we supposed to react when we have the sublime, which relates to God? Wonder and amazement. And in other works, he laments the fact that kids don't have enough wonder and amazement. And probably now with over-programming kids who are never in their yard anymore and things like that, it's probably even less than it ever was. So he says, if you have a child, or if we ourselves have lost our wonder and amazement, we're not going to be spiritual. You'll sit, you'll try to, we have a very wonderful meditation class here, which you can try to attend, and maybe that'll do it. But it could be that you have to have heard the music outside before you can bring it inside into the meditation class. You have to have been listening for this music, or you could find it in your meditation. Then sometimes we speak about the earth is filled with the glory of God. So what is that expression? Is that the sublime or the holy? What is that? Glory is not a physical phenomenon. We say, wow, it's a glorious view. It's a glorious day today. He says, no. It's not the fire, the pillar, the smoke. He said that's not equivalent to the earth is filled with God's glory. It doesn't mean the earth is filled with God's smoke. Or it doesn't work. It's equated with the goodness of God. So this is a very special Jewish idea that when Moses was looking to see God, right? It's on our ark over here. We have that verse on the ark that I'm going to pass all my goodness over you and I call out in the name of God. And then he said, God is merciful and kind and forgiving and all that kind of thing. Because for Moses to learn about God was to learn about his goodness, which, as we said before, was his essence. It's not some sort of outside thing for God. It is the essence of what God is. So this is finding that might be related to finding God in his actions, which we talked about before. One of the two ways was sensing God in the presence of sacred deeds, God's goodness. That's interesting. But both Rabbi Soloveitchik and Heschel both find it necessary to sort of debunk the notion of that nature is where it's at. Maybe, I don't know if there was a special movement in the 50s or what, to say that, if you took your shul outside and you commune with nature, then you really get to the really sublime, and you really meditate, everything will be really great. So the Bible asserts that nature is not everything. In other words, this sort of, is that called nativism? Is that what it's called? Where you kind of long for sort of more of a kind of a Native American kind of an experience of out in nature and smoke pipes, or or what do they have, those the saunas and things. So he says nature is not everything. It calls upon us to remember that what is given is not the ultimate. In other words, what's given, you look at nature and say, oh, that's the given, like in a mathematical equation, there's the given. So, well, the given is nature. So that's not everything. That's exactly what nature should say to you. There's more than meets the eye. The Bible is conscious of the order of nature, just like the Greeks. Oh, there's order. Okay, the order of the planets, that's very nice. But that order is one which was invested in nature by the will of God. We're not interested in so much the order qua order or science. We're interested in that it shows the will of God, and it remains constantly dependent on him. Right? It's not that we don't believe in a God who sort of left nature. He put it in motion and he left, but it remains constantly dependent on it. Biblical man is not enchanted by the given. Right? So even though you'll find many biblical poems that talk about the beauty of nature, it's not about the beauty of nature. It's about the God within the grandeur of nature. Then he says something else which shows his sort of Hasidic roots. Here he's more Hasidic than I am. Again, he has these tremendous deep Hasidic roots, and it's interesting how he wrote this. If he quotes the Talmud, he'll rarely say the word Talmud. He'll just put in a footnote, footnote 3, and then you look at the footnote, it tells you where it is. He didn't want to sort of clutter his writing with Talmud says this, Talmud says that. Whereas he'll quote secular philosophers, or he'll quote a light Jewish source like Midrash, but he often quotes Hasidic stories of different rabbis, and we mentioned the Rabbi Pshicha. He comes up in there, Rabbi Abunim. We mentioned him in connection with the Sfas Emes. In any event, so we mentioned that in Hasidic thinking, there's sort of a pantheism of sorts, that God is in everything. That God is not outside; He's in everything. So too here he says, inanimate objects are dead in relation to man. They're alive in relation to God. I apologize for all the lack of capitalization of God, but it's a computer problem. But in any event, they're alive in relation to God. So for God, the inanimate object is not inanimate. Why? Because it reflects God's grandeur that He made this thing. That would be a natural way of understanding it. I also hear echoes of the Hasidic and mystical idea that God is within everything. They sing to God. So he takes that idea, the Perek Shira, you may be familiar with. There's a song that the animals say in the morning. You can find in the beginning of some Sidurim, some Siddurs, some prayer books. It's a work in which it describes, I think it's about a 1,200-year-old work, something like that, it describes what are the different things say. What does a lion say when he wakes up in the morning? So we'll take a verse and say, the lion says this verse. Don't take a roar is not a roar. A roar is really, he's saying this verse. So again, this is a little too mystical for me, but in any event, that's what he claims. But I think he's just trying to expand on the idea of the godliness in nature, awe in nature, not so much nature as beauty or order. Okay. The essence of things is ineffable, and thus incompatible with the human mind. It's precisely this incompatibility as the source of all creative thinking in art, religion, and moral living. Let's think about that. Let's unpack that. what's the essence of things? He said, well, I don't know the essence. I can't put my finger on it. That's the whole problem, this whole book. I'm just trying to describe the philosophy of something you can't describe. It's the ineffable. He says, well, you can't describe it. It's not subject to human words and language and all the kind of nonsense, right? So it's ineffable. But it doesn't mean we don't know it. We know what it is, but we can't put our finger on it. We can't use words to describe it. And when we realize that, wait a second, there's this experience I'm having, but I can't put it in words, and it can't be described in logical terms, at that point, you realize that's where you might go off into art to try to express yourself. You might go off into some creative way of thinking because words fail you. Or you might go off into religion or moral living because you say, well, you've met the beyond. You've met the meaning in everything. Then again, he doesn't always digress from and reject all kinds of philosophical normative discussions. So he has to of course deal with the argument from design, right? The argument from design says, more or less, and I'm not a great philosopher or expert, but something to the effect that, well, it's like the watch. If you saw a watch and you said, hey, who made this watch? You'd say, oh, nobody made it. It just got there. You say, ha ha, what a fool you are. Of course, somebody had to make the watch. So he says, well, if that's true of a watch, certainly the universe with all the physics and the chemistry and the genes and the DNA and the biochemistry and the organic chemistry and all these molecules and all this stuff going on in there, and this is nobody made this. It's ridiculous. I should have quoted. There was one line where he says, "It's just so obvious. It's just." Oh, it was in a different book. I'm sorry, where he just writes, "We don't need to discuss like whether there's a God. It's just so obvious. I mean, it's like so nonsense to think." But nonetheless, many philosophers apparently feel that it's a fairly good argument, but apparently that you can make counter arguments. But he says, I don't even want to discuss whether it's a good argument or not. I don't even, again, in this anti-philosophical tone in this theme of, I'm not a classic philosopher, I'm not interested in the classic arguments. He says, that's not the problem, whether, well, who made the watch? He says, no. He says, not how it came into being, that's the question that you want to ask. The question that you should ask, and that the real question of religion is, how is it that it is? Right? Not how they make it, but what's it doing here? Right? That's the question we should be asking. That's the philosopher wants to ask, well, how did we get here? We have all these complicated genes and all this biology and chemistry and all this stuff in us, and how did that all happen? And that's what we want to talk about. But that's not what God wants to talk about. God wants to talk about and wants you to talk about is like, hello, did you ever think about like why you're here? So so it's, again, he's debunking classical philosophy. And then he says, and this next statement is a little bit radical, and here you hear echoes of anti-nomian thinking. In other words, to some degree, by being such an ecumenicist and by seeing things so deeply, there's a little bit of a diminution of the significance of any sort of exact word or even ritual, But in many cases, he's trying to promote ritual. But for instance, my uncle had some encounters with him in Boston or wherever it was, and he said, Heschel was just a very inspiring figure. Once he was with him at lunch or something, and it just turned into like this. They were dancing, and they were, he was a very charismatic person. He lived a very inspired Judaism. But the exact rituals, I'm not sure exactly his relationship to it. So here you see a little bit of sort of a critique. Concepts, words, you might substitute laws, rituals, must not become screens. They must be regarded as windows. So he says, let's say you have a word like, I believe in God. Let's say you have a concept of Exodus from Egypt, Sinai. So what happens is they become the screen. You can't get past it. It's the screen, and it projects your belief on it, and then it's shallow. It's just as thick as a screen. No, it should be a window. All rituals, all words, all concepts, all beliefs, it should all be a window into the great numinous, the great mysterious beyond, into the real truths of life, into the real philosophy and the real. So it should be a window. There's some real poetry for you there. For the essence of the greatness of man do not lie in his ability to please his ego, to satisfy his needs, right? Again, Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote that one of the greatnesses of man is that he can bring himself greater dignity. He can create an airplane so he doesn't have to sweat as he walks a 5-day journey from Boston to New York, but he can instead he can get there and read the newspaper and kick his legs up and he can have great dignity. But he says, nah, that's not the greatness of man, so that you to satisfy your needs and your ego, but rather in his ability to stand above his ego, to ignore his own needs, here to sacrifice his own interests for the sake of the holy. Here, he and Rabbi Soloveitchik overlap. Rabbi Soloveitchik talks about the heroism. Judaism, heroism is, there's a young boy, young girl, and the biology and the passion is there, but they say, it's not the right time, and we can't touch each other, or whatever the rules may be. That's great heroism, to stand above your personal needs. He doesn't put it in halachic terms, or Rabbi Soloveitchik does, but the essence is not to please your ego. So in many essays, he rails against what he sees as people are only interested in their needs. They see religion as primarily there to answer my needs, right? Rabbi, what do you do for me, right? Your speeches don't move me. I want to. It's not doing anything for me. I want it to do something for me, right? And the question is not how religion can stroke your ego or meet your needs or meet your family's needs and that kind of thing, but rather it asks you to put aside your needs for the sake of something beyond yourself. So it's very, very different. Again, it's a consumer culture. We approach religion, the rabbi, the synagogue, the Torah in terms of how can this meet my needs. So he's very much he's very upset about this. The meaning and spiritual relevance of man is the question worship can answer, is the answer. So then we asked before, what's the question to which religion is the answer? So he says, when I worship, hopefully I come to the meaning of man and the spiritual relevance of man to God, I guess. And that's where worship becomes the answer. There is a certainty without knowledge in the depth of our being that accounts for our asking the ultimate question. It lies beyond all formalization and verbalization. Saying the following. Do we know God? Well, you have to ask the philosophers whether we can know him or not know him. Right? We had a fellow here, Joel. He was very big on modern philosophy. He says the modern philosophers decided that we can know God. Okay, I don't know. So it is that you can prove God. I don't know, but it's a technical kind of a thing. You can prove, but he says no. Without knowledge, in other words, without proving God, there is a certainty anyway. Where is it? It's in the depth of our being. And it accounts for asking the ultimate question. In other words, why do you ask the question, hey, what am I doing here? Hey, what is this all about? What's the meaning of life? You know why you ask that? Because you get it, because there's something beyond you. In 2 minutes, we're going to take a break for 1 minute, but we'll continue. It lies beyond all formalization and verbalization. You can't even ask me, what question about existence are you trying to answer? Don't ask me that question, right? Let's talk about what you're feeling that makes you want to ask this. I can't do it. So he talks about. He has an expression. I didn't write it down. As a pre-conceptualization or something like that. That there's an idea of there's a thought in my mind before I even got to ask the question of what am I doing here. It was that impetus. That's the God. That's where I met God. That's where the rubber meets God, so to speak. Now for the title of the book, which again I don't see it crying out in every line, but maybe I must have missed something. But anyway, he says, it is God's concern for man that cries out behind every word of the message. When we look in the Bible, it's God's concern for man. The Torah is God's concern for man. Today we read it as, oh, how is it going to make me more spiritual so I can enjoy it more, right? That's what, read a passage to me. It's a nice bedtime story that's going to excite me. So it'll excite my intellectual interest in analyzing, structures of passages, or it'll satisfy my mythological need for something beyond me. But he says, no, it's God's concern for man should be calling out. That's what you should be hearing in biblical passages. But how do we become aware of God's concern? So he says we need to understand the situation in which we are concerned with the ultimate question. Where do you get to a point, when do you get to a point where you are concerned with the ultimate questions, whatever those questions are? Remember, we started off by saying that the ultimate questions, that's what we should be answering. Well, the situation you could be in, which would get you to the point that you would come to that preconceptualization, you would come to ask that question, is a situation in which you are challenged, aroused, stirred by the sublime, to the marvel, the mystery, and the presence of God. We do not choose to raise the question, we are compelled. There are moments in life where we are compelled to ask the question. You might have the classic foxhole, but it might be something much more mundane, of just feeling good one day and waking up in the morning, or feeling rotten and coming to God there. That man's question about God is God's question of man. When you come to the real question, that'll actually be God asking you, hey, how you doing? Hello, nice to meet you. When do you get there? When on that particular day. Now, here you hear echoes of sort of like a man who says, well, I can't really pray every day. There's sort of a confessional aspect I found in some of the writings that it's like, well, I couldn't always pray, but when he occasionally does, he has these bursts of inspiration. And again, even people who pray every day, surely for most people who pray every day, there's rarely the great burst, but once in a while there is. The prayer provides that structure, which there can be that great burst of the question. So that is sort of, if you ask, all these words here and rabbis going on and on, what's the essence here? This would be a very key line where he says that the moment at which you somehow meet the marvel, the awe, the mystery, the presence, and when you're stirred to that one moment, it may be one moment in 10 years or in 5 years, in a year or a month, where you have that, at that moment, it's also God's question of man. Now, so far, I didn't talk that much about sources. What are his sources? So here and there, as I said, here and there are some really great footnotes that you can find. So for instance, the idea that sometimes God helps you along. God helps you. In other words, you think that you're going to find God. No, He has to ask you the question. So there's an idea that we need help from God to find God. So in that sense, it's God in search of man, meaning He wouldn't help you if He didn't want you to find Him. So he says, well, where do you find that? He says, well, He opened Hagar's eyes so she could see. And he takes it as a metaphor for everybody. That sometimes, maybe not often, but God opens your eyes so you can see God. And then he would say, first we have to make sure we're not too egocentric. That our whole focus is not my needs, and that'll make us more open. And then you have to wait for that moment to be called. And then you have to use those moments. He explains that the rituals, he's going to say in a minute, that the rituals are your way of trying to ground those experiences down, to nail them down and keep them a little longer. But also the Guide to Perplex also says, that's Maimonides, that it must be clearly understood that when one of those who has seen deeper insights wishes to tell by word of mouth or in writing anything of the mysteries which he grasps, it is not possible for him to explain it clearly, systematically, whenever he's comprehended. We just read the first chapter in Ezekiel. That's not what he saw. I don't claim to know whether angels do have wings or don't have wings. I don't know, but that's not the be-all and end-all of that chapter. It's something much deeper, and that's why the rabbis tell us not to read it, because we have no idea what we're reading. Right? So it's really indescribable. Now, if you take that to its extreme extension, you get to a rather unorthodox view that everything that it says in the Bible is not really what it says. And there may be some element of that in his writings, and I'm not here to discuss it or I don't know. But certainly I wouldn't want to go too far on that idea that everything's not what it appears to be. Moving along. What are some sources for the idea that God's in search of man, that God is actually calling out to us, and that's the ultimate question, is that God is searching us, and we have to hear that call, and we have to respond to it. Well, there's a verse in Job. It says, "You hunt me like a lion." God is hunting us. Well, that may be negative, that he's doing us in, but he is hunting us. Judah Halevi, the great medieval poet, "I have sought your nearness with all my heart, and I have called you, and going out to meet you, I found you coming toward me." Right? So clearly, Song of Songs, clearly God is also courting us as much as we court him. Also, most famous verse, when Adam and Eve, I guess, are running from God's presence, the Lord called, "Where are you?" So we see God in search of man. Religion consists of God's question and man's answer. So usually we just do the answer. In other words, okay, I was born Jewish, I have the answers, these are the answers. So he says we have to remember that it's in response to the call of God. Unless God asks the question, will our inquiries be in vain? Right. In other words, again, he's poking fun of modern philosophy. He's saying we're going to start asking, things that are not God's question. Why is there God? Do we know there's a God? It's not God's question. You're not going to get anywhere with that. That is. The answer lasts a moment. He says when we get to that moment, that moment of inspiration that Estelina is looking for, we're all looking for, that only is for a moment, and then you have to hold on to it. The Hasidim have an idea that, you got an inspiration, you liked Shavuos, then after Shavuos, you better sit down and learn more, study more, drive it home. So that's one of the ideas. To strengthen our alertness, to refine our appreciation of the mystery, is the meaning of worship and observance. So in other words, here he finally gets to observance. Well, and he does have some chapters about observance and mitzvot. I'll just allude to it. But that strengthens our alertness. It refines our appreciation of the mystery, of the meaning, right? To do worship and to do observance. But again, he's a pluralist, so he would believe that there are different roads to it, etc. Beautiful statement. Man's mind has no access to a ladder upon which he can, on his own strength, rise to knowledge of God. This is one of the best philosophy class. We're not going to know God anyway. Give it up. Yet his soul is endowed with translucent windows that open to the beyond. Your mind won't be able to apprehend God, but your soul can get a translucent window. It's not a clear window. Translucent window, which is a Talmudic allusion. The Aspaklaria, it's the name of his book in the 60s. Aspaklaria means there are some crystal balls that are clear and some are not so clear, so it's a translucent one. For God is not always silent and is not always, and I think it means we're not always blind. We are not always blind. There is loneliness in us that hears. So here the echoes of Rabbi Soloveitchik, it goes back to the existentialist philosophers, that when there's loneliness, in our loneliness we find God. Rabbi Soloveitchik was very big on that. He has a one-liner that alludes to that. In us, we can hear God when we're lonely. We must first peer into the darkness, feel strangled and entombed in the hopelessness of living without God before we are ready to feel the presence of his living light. So this is a depressing thought. Rabbi Soloveitchik also said that religion is not about everything's going great and la-di-da type of thing. Religion is about living very deeply, and in that depth, experience, and sometimes in the strangling feeling of hopelessness, we can find God. But there's a light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, it's not depressing. When you go to down that tunnel, you'll hopefully meet God in your giving up on your ego and all that. We do not have to discover the world, we only have to recover it. Tshuva means to recover. Jewish repentance is to recover, not to discover. Okay, moving along. An interesting one-liner there. God is of no importance unless he's of supreme importance. I've debated some of my congregants about that. Right? In other words, Rabbi Lichtenstein wrote that it has axiological monopoly. Right? Once you assert that religion is religion, God is God, then it's not that we're true. Other things can coexist, but they're relatively insignificant, right? So again, the general modern Orthodox view says, well, you have your secular studies and your Jewish studies. You have your Torah and your Mada, the science and religion. You have Rabbi Soloveitchik, you have the quest to go out and do stuff, and you also have the quest to understand things and be humbled by nature. Seem like co-equal partners, but Rabbi Lichtenstein and here in this line as well, you have the idea that if religion is important at all, then it's of supreme importance. Now, it doesn't mean that we have to spend our whole day on it. We might starve to death. But it's in terms of not quantity, but quality. Torah is not our wisdom or our literature, but our essence. Again, it's a very anti-intellectual approach. I'm sure all the intellectuals didn't like this type of idea. It's our essence, right? So, in other words, to say that, what is the Torah going to give you? Oh, it's going to give you the ultimate answers to all the questions. That's an intellectual thing, but you can't get all the ultimate answers to everything. So really, it's just your essence. Okay. The Bible is an answer to the supreme question, what does God demand of us? Yeah, now this is very anti-modern, right? The modern doesn't want to be demanded anything, right? The rabbi, who's he to tell me? He's just an employee, right? Right. What God demands, right? You come on Yom Kippur or something, and they tell me that God demands things. I want to know what I can get out of the Torah. There is a passion and a drive for Now, an allusion to the Holocaust. He doesn't. They weren't really using the word Holocaust yet, but you can see allusions to it. In that little Wikipedia piece at the beginning, he says some pretty harsh words about the people who destroyed his family. But there is a passion and a drive for cruel deeds which only the awe and the fear of God can soothe. In other words, the evil inclination is so big, the capacity of human, forget about my evil inclination, the capacity of the human being for evil, which we saw in these cruel other people in Europe over there, but it is in the human condition. Only awe and fear can soothe that. And only holiness can ventilate it. There is a suffocating selfishness in man, etc., etc. Listen to this. Next paragraph. Unless history is a vagary of nonsense, there must be a counterpart to the immense power of man to destroy. There must be a voice that says no to man. He says, people wonder, he says, really? God spoke to man? I mean, do you know anything about the cosmos? You know how many different planets there are out there? How many different universes there are out there? We're nothing. God's going to talk to us. Why would he talk to us? And secondly, you know how insignificant you are? So he says, insignificant? Really? I think he's talking in the nuclear, what was that called? The era of nuclear proliferation, and mutual destruction, and the Cold War. In the era of the Cold War, he said, man's insignificant. He can destroy the whole world. That's insignificant. So he says, so there must be a voice that says no to man. Not a vague voice, faint and inward, like qualms of conscience. That's not going to be strong enough to fight evil. But it has to be equal in spiritual might to man's power to destroy. In other words, if you say that God, he's limited. He can't really say anything. He can't really do anything. He can't. That God, if that's all we've got, then we're in big trouble. There must be a God that can command and direct and say no to us. The Bible is a quest for the righteous man, for righteous people. Here is God's search for man. The Bible is saying, are there any righteous people out there? A call for righteous people. The incidents recorded in the Bible, to the discerning eye, if you have a good eye, are episodes of one great drama. The quest of God for man. He says, hey, Abraham, are you good? Well, Ishmael, Yitzchak, wait a second, Esau, Jacob, brother, Shimon, Levi, is there anybody good out there? So that's how you read the Bible. And man's flight from him. We keep reading about the flight, right? Throughout the period of kings, everybody's running away from God. There are events which never become past. Sacred history may be described as an attempt to overcome the dividing line of past and present. It's an attempt to see the past as the present tense. Every act done in agreement. Then he gets off into another topic, should be a different paragraph. What's a mitzvah? What is a mitzvah? Every act done in agreement with the will of God is a mitzvah. Interesting. It's because of a unique conception of a mitzvah as an almost concrete entity. It's hard to find the equivalent to it. In other words, it's not a good deed, it's not a commandment. It's, when you do a mitzvah, it's like a thing. It's like it has a life of its own. So, it's interesting. Anyway, as he heads off to the end of the book, he does describe Sabbath, which he has in a whole separate book. I'm sorry, I didn't have a full copy of it here, but I read it over the years. There's a passage about it here. Let's read these two passages, one from the God in Search of Man, where he actually references his book about Sabbath, and then another one we're taken out of the book about Sabbath. Who would like to read that for us? What is the Sabbath? Who would like to read that for us? Please.
What is the Sabbath? A reminder of every man's royalty, an abolition of the distinction of master and slave, rich and poor, success and failure. To celebrate the Sabbath is to experience the ultimate independence of civilization and society from achievement and anxiety. The Sabbath is an embodiment of the belief that all men are equal and that the equality of man means the nobility of man.
Go ahead.
The greatest sin of a man is to forget that he's a prince. The Sabbath is an assurance that the Spirit is greater than the universe, but beyond the good is the holy. The Sabbath is holiness in time. What is the Sabbath? The presence of the eternity, the moment of majesty, the radiance.
Keep going. There you go.
The radiance of joy. The Sabbath is the counterpoint of wisdom, the melody sustained throughout all agitations and vicissitudes which menace our conscience, our awareness of God's presence in the world. It teaches us to sense the delights of the Spirit, the joys of the good, the grandeur of living in the face of eternity.
So Shabbos is the answer to all these questions. In other words, you want to get to the meaning of life, the meaning of man. Shabbos is what that's all about. Go ahead.
Harassed, pursued with enmity and wrong, our fathers continue to feel joy in being Jews. Happy are we and how beautiful our heritage. What is the source of that feeling? We are summoned and cannot forget it as we wind the clock of eternal history. We remember the beginning and believe in them and believe in an end, and we live between two historic poles, Sinai and the kingdom of God.
So maybe we're called, God in the Search of Man, we're called at Sinai, and we're called to the end of our history, the Messianic era, and we're summoned and can't forget it. We have the mitzvah. We hear the voice of God calling to us, and that's God in Search of Man, and that's where man finds meaning, because we're summoned. We are people of mitzvot, and we're summoned, and it's a message for everyone. And to get a little flavor of the beautiful volume called the Shabbat, which was a beautiful short volume. This is actually a more hefty volume, but the Shabbat is a short book, but very well read and very popular. Who would like to read that for us? Judaism.
Judaism is a religion of time, aiming at the unification of time. Unlike the space-minded man to whom time is unvaried, iterative, homogeneous, to whom all hours are alike, qualityless, empty shells, the Bible senses the diversified character of time. There are no 2 hours alike. Every hour is unique and the only one given at the moment, exclusive and endlessly precious. One of the most distinguished words in the Bible is the word kadosh, holy, a word which is more than any other, is representative of the mystery and the majesty of the divine. Now, what was the first holy object in the history of the world? Was it a mountain? Was it an altar? It is, indeed, a unique occasion at which the distinguished word kadosh is used for the first time in the book of Genesis at the end of the story of creation. How extremely significant is the fact that it is applied to time. And God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. There is no reference in the record of creation to any object in space that would be endowed with the quality of holiness. This is a radical departure from accustomed religious thinking. The mythical mind would expect that after heaven and earth had been established, God would create a holy place, a holy mountain or holy spring, whereupon a sanctuary is to be established. Yet it is as if to the Bible it is holiness in time, the Sabbath which comes first. The meaning of the Sabbath is to celebrate time rather than space. 6 days a week we live under the tyranny of things of space. On the Sabbath we try to become attuned to holiness in time. It is a day on which we are called upon to share in which what is eternal in time, to turn from the results of creation to the mystery of creation, from the world of creation to the creation of the world. No petition
So, there's something about Rabbi Lichtenstein and his views on Shabbat. But in any event, I hope that gives you a little, the rest of what we read were snippets from Heschel, so I hope this gives you a little sense of the flow of the poetry and the beauty of his writing, which we didn't fully capture here, but this is nonetheless very beautiful. So, in some ways, a lot of his books overlap, and he references one book in the other, because if the whole purpose of life is to find the meaning, so Shabbat is all about that, finding the meaning, but in a unique Jewish way in which we find God not in things, because you see he's very anti-materialistic, but rather we find God in time. And I think people in that era are also very interested in the relationship of time and space because of Einstein and all that. So a lot of the Rabbi Salvation, other writers, very much interested in that. So in any event, I know it's a little late, so we'll close here. But Doctor, if you had any closing comments, I would welcome them.
Brilliant, which we wouldn't expect anything less from you, but that's exactly right. He really did not look at the Torah as we do. You try to find out about God. And I think from my clarity, he is saying the Torah is God's understanding of us. His plea that God is in search of us. And we need to start searching for him and start for what he's searching for us. And our response should be what he calls radical amazement. There was a wonderful story, if you have time for a story. Rabbi Neil Gilman, who was a professor at JTS, who was one of Heschel's students, attended a Challah, and he gave this story. He said, it was a very pretty spring day, and the trees, you know how the pollen sacks hang down from the trees, and Rabbi Heschel comes in, he looks out the window, and he says, the trees are wearing talaisim. That's radical amazement. He was a very difficult character because he grew up with love for 10 years, and then when his father died, his mother gave him to her brother, Kutzker Rebbe, who was very strict. And then he said that was too much. Orthodox was too much, so we went to secular, to Berlin. And then, of course, with the Holocaust, he was rescued by the HUC, Morgenstern, and that was just too liberal for him. And then he went to JTS, and they were too much for him. So his life really wound up in the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War. One last story said that he gave a lecture, gave an assignment on Maimonides, term paper. The student turned it in. He took him and threw him in the waste bin. He said, now I want to talk to you about the Vietnam War. You did great. This is exactly it. So I love this. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
But I suppose, in the traditional sense, we could say that when we do mitzvot, we say, well, what do you need all these mitzvot for? Say, well, if that's what God wants in quest of man, if that's what he wants, then instead of asking, well, but what can we do that would be more meaningful for us, we shouldn't ask that. We should ask, what does God want of us? So, and that's what the Torah is about. Yeah.
My favorite experience, he said, God is above religion.
Right. I'm not sure where that goes, but yes, but there's an element of truth there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for joining us. Okay, next week we'll be on Wednesday again, and the next week will probably be much closer to 8:30 because of Mincha. So I'm sorry. We'll try to keep it to about 8:30 to 9:30.